You look at the snapshot and feel nothing at first. A stiff Victorian mother, obedient daughters, a baby posed like a prop, the kind of family portrait that fills archives by the thousands, decorous, silent, forgettable. Then, you notice the toddler's hands. Archivist Mark Thorne noticed them, late on a gray afternoon while sorting glass negatives from a defunct Chicago studio. The envelope was brittle and neatly labeled in copperplate script, "The Vance Family, 1908." Nothing about it suggested rarity. Wealthy families commissioned these portraits the way they ordered stationery, rituals of status, not emotion. The image showed Eleanor Vance seated in a high-backed chair, posture rigid, chin lifted just enough to signal breeding rather than warmth. Two older girls stood at her sides, symmetrically arranged, their dresses identical down to the pleats. On Eleanor's lap sat the youngest child, a toddler named Penny, her small body held in place by her mother's arm, like a parcel balanced for the camera. Mark almost filed it away untouched. What stopped him was the object in Penny's hands. It wasn't a doll. It wasn't a rattle. It wasn't even something that belonged near a child. The toddler was gripping a man's pocket watch, large, heavy, unmistakably adult. Its gold casing dwarfed her fingers. The chain dangled uselessly against the white fabric of her dress, catching the studio light in a way that felt deliberate. That alone was odd. Upper-class families were careful with symbolism. Props and portraits were chosen with intent, books for intellect, flowers for purity, toys for innocence. A steel magnate's family would never place a valuable timepiece in a child's grasp for a formal sitting. Mark initiated a high-resolution scan. Under magnification, the watch changed the entire photograph. The crystal covering the dial was shattered, not cracked, but broken inward, as if struck with force. Tiny fractures radiated from a central impact point. The hands of the watch were frozen at a precise angle, neither aligned nor naturally resting, as though time itself had been interrupted mid-motion. There were no loose shards on the dress. No signs the damage happened during the sitting. This watch had been broken before the photograph was taken. Mark leaned closer, heart tightening. Why give a child a broken object? Why immortalize damage in a portrait meant to project stability? He adjusted contrast and exposure, isolating the watch from the rest of the image. The toddler's grip was not playful. Her fingers were clenched, knuckles faintly pale, as if she had been told, forced, not to let go. Mark glanced back at Eleanor Vance's face. Her expression no longer looked stern, it looked controlled, and suddenly, the photograph was no longer boring. It was staged, and something in it was desperately wrong. The watch sat at the exact center of the composition, dead center, framed by Eleanor's dark bodice and the child's white dress, impossible to miss once seen. It wasn't an accident. It was a statement. Mark closed the archive drawer and tagged the negative for review. Because family portraits do not include broken heirlooms by chance, and children do not hold evidence unless someone wants it seen. By the following morning, Mark Thorne had not slept. The image refused to leave his mind, not because it was grotesque, but because it was controlled. Every element felt restrained, as though emotion itself had been beaten into stillness. He knew better than to pursue a theory alone. Archive work rewarded patience, not obsession. He called Sarah Jenkins, a historian specializing in early 20th century American industrial dynasties, steel, rail, coal, and the quiet wars they waged in boardrooms and bedrooms alike. Sarah arrived with notebooks, skepticism, and the calm of someone accustomed to finding rot beneath polished surfaces. The name Vance caught her attention immediately. Thomas Vance had not been a minor figure. He was part of Chicago's second-generation steel boom, less visible than Carnegie, but deeply entrenched in regional supply chains. His company supplied rail fasteners, structural beams, and munitions-grade steel alloys. Wealthy, discreet, and by most contemporary accounts, cautious. According to the official record, Sarah said, scanning digitized newspapers from December 1908, Thomas Vance abandoned his family just before Christmas. Supposedly ran off to Europe with a stage actress. Paris or Vienna, depending on the gossip column. Mark frowned. No police report. No missing person notice. Exactly, Sarah replied, which already makes the story unusual. Men vanished often, but not without creditors making noise. The business pages told a cleaner story. Within days of Thomas's disappearance, control of Vance Steel transferred smoothly to his partner, Arthur Clayton. Banks expressed confidence. Stockholders remained calm. There were no court challenges, no injunctions, no public disputes. Too clean. Sarah outlined the prevailing interpretation historians had accepted for over a century. Thomas, tired of domestic life, fled scandalously. Eleanor, humiliated but practical, posed for a formal portrait to reassure society that the family remained intact and dignified. The photograph, dated late December 1908, fit neatly into that narrative. Stability after disgrace. The watch? Mark asked. Sarah shrugged. At first glance, a mistake. Children ruin things, a dropped heirloom. Photographers weren't always attentive to props. It was a reasonable hypothesis. But when Sarah examined the magnified scan herself, her tone shifted. That isn't a child's accident, she said quietly. The glass is shattered inward. This watch was struck. They examined the image again, now contextualized by what they knew of the Vance household. The studio itself was one frequented by Chicago's elite. Appointments scheduled weeks in advance, sessions carefully choreographed. Nothing was casual, nothing was spontaneous. If the photo was taken after Thomas's supposed flight, then why immortalize a damaged object belonging to him? Mark pulled a ledger from the archive, studio records. The date of the sitting aligned not with public rumors, but with the narrow window between Thomas's last confirmed sighting and the legal transfer of his assets. A liminal moment. Sarah leaned back slowly. If Eleanor believed her husband had truly abandoned her, she would erase him, not place his broken possession at the center of the frame. The hypothesis began to crack. Perhaps the photograph was not about dignity. Perhaps it was about performance. A message crafted under pressure. An image designed to look normal while concealing something else entirely. The question, Sarah said, is who needed this image and who it was meant to deceive. Mark looked again at the toddler's clenched hands, at Eleanor's rigid posture, at the perfect symmetry of the older girls. And for the first time, the idea surfaced, not as a theory, but as a dread. What if this photograph was not taken freely? What if it wasn't evidence of survival, but proof of captivity? The second scan took nearly 4 hours. Mark Thorne reran the negative through multispectral filters normally reserved for damaged battlefield photographs. Dust, emulsion scratches, chemical noise. Each layer was stripped away until only intention remained. When the image stabilized, the room went quiet in a way Mark had learned to fear. The first thing that changed was the mother's eyes. At standard resolution, Eleanor Vance looked composed, aloof, even proud. Under enhancement, her pupils were abnormally dilated, swallowing the pale irises almost entirely. This was not the effect of studio lighting. It was physiological. Sarah recognized it immediately. Belladonna, she said, or shock, possibly both. In Edwardian medicine, belladonna was commonly used as a sedative to calm hysteria, induce compliance, or suppress panic before medical procedures. Eleanor's gaze was fixed on the lens, but it wasn't present. It was the stare of someone chemically slowed, fighting through fog to remain conscious. Then Mark isolated Eleanor's right hand. What had seemed like a maternal gesture, her palm resting on Penny's waist, resolved into something else entirely. Her fingers were not curved in support. They were hooked. The fabric of the child's dress was twisted and compressed beneath her grip, pulled so tight that the weave strained visibly. Eleanor's knuckles were white, bloodless. "That's not reassurance," Sarah whispered. "That's restraint. A mother doesn't grip a child like that for a portrait. She grips like that when she's afraid the child might move or scream." Mark advanced to the background. The studio backdrop was typical. Painted drapery, a column, A decorative mirror hung slightly off-center. In most scans, the mirror was useless, washed out by the photographer's flash. But when Mark adjusted exposure timing to isolate reflective anomalies, something appeared. A silhouette. Faint. Distorted. Standing just inside the doorway behind the photographer. It was the outline of a man. He wasn't posed. He wasn't part of the composition. His body language was wrong for a studio assistant. Feet planted wide, shoulders angled forward. In his hand was a cane, but not held like support. The cane was raised slightly, angled downward, gripped at the thick end, like a club. The silhouette's head was turned, not toward the family, but toward Eleanor, watching her. Mark sat back, breath shallow. This wasn't privacy, he said. This was supervision. The timing clicked into place. Edwardian portrait exposures required stillness, long seconds of immobility. Children were often restrained off camera to prevent movement, but here the restraint was psychological and physical. Eleanor was not posing. She was complying. Sarah traced the implications aloud carefully, as if the photograph itself might overhear them. If there was a man in the room controlling the sitting, if Eleanor was sedated, if the children were arranged and substituted. Her voice trailed off. They returned to the watch. Under magnification, tiny flecks of dark residue were visible inside the shattered crystal. Not dirt, not oil. Something thicker, organic. The break pattern suggested a single, forceful impact. Sharp enough to shatter glass, heavy enough to stop the mechanism instantly. Time had not merely stopped, it had been stopped. The experts exchanged a look neither of them wanted to name. This photograph was not commemorating endurance after abandonment. It was documenting a moment of terror, a performance staged under threat. A family frozen not by the limits of early photography, but by fear. And somewhere, just outside the frame, stood the man who ensured their silence. The realization settled heavily between them. This image was taken either moments before a crime or moments after. And whichever was true, the photograph itself had become part of the violence. Once the possibility of coercion entered the analysis, the historical record could no longer be read at face value. Mark Thorne and Sarah Jenkins began reconstructing the final week of December 1908, hour by hour, pulling from shipping logs, bank ledgers, police blotters, and the personal correspondence of men who believed history would never look back at them. The official story unraveled almost immediately. Thomas Vance was last seen alive on the evening of December 24th, leaving his steel office after a late meeting. The weather was brutal. Ice on the streets, wind cutting through the river corridor. His carriage never reached home. No hotel registered him. No port recorded his departure. No theater ticket was ever traced to the supposed actress he allegedly fled with. Disappearance, yes. Escape, no. Attention turned to Arthur Clayton. Clayton had always been described as the quieter half of the partnership. Where Vance negotiated contracts, Clayton handled enforcement, payroll disputes, union suppression, security arrangements. His name appeared repeatedly in private memos tied to hired guards and off-the-books payments during strikes. In the days following Thomas's disappearance, Clayton moved with astonishing speed. Within 48 hours, banks received written assurance that Thomas had voluntarily relinquished operational control. Signatures appeared, clean, confident, unmistakably forged. Investors were summoned, soothed, and shown evidence that the Vance household remained stable, including a photograph. The timing was critical. Steel markets were volatile. A rumor of murder or internal conflict could have collapsed credit lines overnight. Clayton did not need Thomas alive. He needed him quiet. Sarah located a previously overlooked detail. The portrait studio had been booked not by Eleanor, but by a representative of Vance Steel. The fee was paid in cash. The photographer later submitted a supplemental charge for extended sitting due to child compliance issues. Child compliance. The phrase sat like poison on the page. Mark reconstructed the likely sequence. Thomas is confronted on the night of December 24th, possibly at the factory itself, where noise and machinery could swallow violence whole. The pocket watch, a personal object he always carried, is struck during the altercation. The blow that shatters the glass may not have been intended for the watch at all. Thomas never leaves the building. By morning, Eleanor is informed, implicitly, not directly. Clayton does not need her belief. He needs her obedience. Her daughters are leverage. Her youngest is insurance. The portrait is arranged quickly, before questions are asked, before absence becomes suspicion. Eleanor is given instructions. Sit. Hold the child. Do not move. Do not speak. The older girls present are not her daughters at all, but substitutes. Children who can be returned later, children whose fear does not matter. Eleanor understands this immediately. She understands more than Clayton realizes. The cane in the mirror is not symbolic, it is functional. The photograph is taken, not as a keepsake, not as a memory, but as a legal instrument. Visual proof that the Vance family appears intact, cooperative, alive. A shield against scrutiny, while forged documents circulate through banks and courts. When the shutter closes, Clayton has what he needs. The family does not. Eleanor remains silent because silence is demanded. But within that silence, she does the only thing left to her. She embeds the truth where it cannot be removed without destroying the image itself. The broken watch, the frozen time, the object Clayton did not think to fear, because he believed photographs only captured what was meant to be seen. He never considered that one could also record an accusation. Proof did not come from police files or court records. Those had been scrubbed clean long before anyone thought to look. It came from a place designed to erase inconvenient people. The breakthrough arrived when Sarah Jenkins traced Eleanor Vance's name to a private medical institution on the outskirts of Chicago, an asylum that no longer existed, absorbed into municipal expansion and later demolished. Its surviving intake ledgers had been boxed and forgotten in a county warehouse, misfiled under public health expenditures. Eleanor was admitted 2 weeks after the photograph was taken. The diagnosis was predictable for the era: acute hysteria, delusional fixation, emotional instability. Nothing about trauma, nothing about coercion, nothing about grief. She had been declared unfit to testify, unfit to manage property, unfit to contradict powerful men. What stopped Mark cold was not the diagnosis, it was the inventory list. Upon admission, Eleanor's personal effects were cataloged in careful handwriting. One dress, one wedding ring, a set of hairpins, and one gold pocket watch, cracked crystal, non-functional. The serial number was recorded. When Mark Thorne cross-referenced it against Vance Steel insurance documents, the match was exact. The watch belonged to Thomas Vance. It had been registered years earlier as a personal item carried daily due to its sentimental value, a retirement gift from his first foreman. Eleanor had kept it, not as evidence, as a burden. The watch had not been planted in the asylum records by accident. It had been taken from her because it mattered, because it connected her to something she was not allowed to speak aloud. But the final revelation was still waiting. Sarah submitted the portrait for modern biometric analysis. Not facial recognition in the legal sense, but comparative proportional mapping, bone spacing, jaw angles, orbital depth, the kind of analysis used to identify victims in century-old disaster photographs. The results were unequivocal. The two older girls standing beside Eleanor were not Clara and Rose Vance. Their facial ratios did not match known childhood photographs recovered from a school registry dated earlier that same year. Ear placement differed. Nasal bridges were inconsistent. Even height progression was wrong. They were substitutes. Children dressed in the missing girls' clothing, styled to resemble them at a distance, posed just long enough to complete the illusion of family continuity. Only two figures in the photograph were authentic: Eleanor, and the baby, Penny. Clara, 9 years old, and Rose, 11, had already been removed from the household by the time the portrait was taken. Where they were sent, if they were sent anywhere at all, remains unknown. No school record, census entry, or burial notice has ever been found. Eleanor knew this as she sat for the photograph. She knew the children beside her were strangers. She knew her real daughters were gone. She knew the man behind the camera controlled whether she would ever see them again. Her silence was not ignorance, it was terror. And yet, within that terror, she acted. She placed the one true object she had left, the broken watch of a murdered husband, into the hands of the only real child present. The one witness Clayton could not fully replace. The photograph was no longer merely staged, it was falsified. A crime scene populated with stand-ins, anchored by a single, undeniable relic of violence. Eleanor sat surrounded by borrowed children, holding the weight of two missing daughters and one dead husband, while the man responsible waited just outside the frame, confident that the truth, once hidden, would stay buried forever. He was wrong. The photograph remembered what everyone else tried to forget. With the substitutions exposed and the watch traced, the photograph could finally be read for what it truly was: not a record of a family, but a message, one composed under threat, encoded in the only language Eleanor Vance believed might survive her. Mark Thorne printed the image at full scale and pinned it to the analysis board. Once the context was known, the composition no longer felt accidental. Every element aligned with intention. The center of gravity was not Eleanor's face. It was the watch. Early 20th century studio photography followed rigid compositional rules. The most important object was placed at the visual center, often highlighted by contrast. Here, the watch rested against Penny's white dress, the brightest surface in the frame, ensuring the eye would be drawn to it before anything else. Eleanor had made a choice. She did not hide the watch. She did not keep it close to her own body. She surrendered it to the child. That mattered. In period symbolism, children in portraits represented continuity, what endured beyond death. By placing the watch in Penny's hands, Eleanor was assigning the object a future, trusting that one day someone would look closely enough to ask why it was there at all. Mark magnified the dial again, isolating the hands. They were frozen at 14:15. Not a decorative position, not symmetrical, not random. Sarah cross-referenced the time with factory logs recovered from Vance Steele's night shift records. On December 24, 1908, a machinery stoppage had been recorded at precisely 2:15 p.m., an unscheduled halt attributed vaguely to equipment failure. The same department Thomas Vance was known to inspect personally. Time did not stop on the watch by coincidence. It stopped when Thomas did. The shattered crystal told the rest of the story. Watches break outward when dropped. This one broke inward. The force came from above, concentrated, violent. The kind of blow delivered not by gravity, but by intent. The cane seen in the mirror reflection was no longer an abstract threat. It was the weapon that completed the message. Eleanor understood that she would never testify. She would never stand in a courtroom. Her words would be dismissed as hysteria the moment she spoke them. So she did not speak. She used symbols: a dead man's watch, a frozen time, a broken face of glass, placed at the heart of a portrait meant to prove that everything was fine. The photograph became a contradiction Clayton never noticed. He saw compliance. Banks saw stability. Society saw a dignified widow carrying on after scandal. What Eleanor embedded was something else entirely: a death certificate. By centering the dead watch on the only genuine child present, she declared that Thomas Vance was not absent. He was ended. And by allowing the man with the cane to remain faintly visible in the mirror, She marked the presence of the color without naming him. The accusation was complete. My husband is dead. His time ended here. And the man responsible is standing just outside your view. It was a perfect crime message precisely because it looked harmless. Clayton believed photographs froze appearances, not truths. He never imagined that the very stillness he demanded could be turned against him. The image waited, silent, patient. For more than a century, Eleanor's scream remained locked inside silver grains and shattered glass, until someone finally learned how to listen to what a photograph was never supposed to say. The truth, once reconstructed, arrived too late to save anyone it mattered to. The photograph was accepted without question. Banks filed it. Investors circulated it. Newspapers referenced it obliquely as evidence that the Vance household remained orderly and dignified despite recent personal changes. In an era that trusted images more than women, the portrait did exactly what it was designed to do, just not for the person who designed it. Arthur Clayton's ascent was uninterrupted. With no public dispute and no body to mourn, Thomas Vance became a rumor rather than a crime. Clayton absorbed full control of Vance Steel, expanded production contracts, and quietly aligned himself with municipal suppliers. Within a decade, his name appeared on hospitals, libraries, and donor plaques. He was described in obituaries as disciplined, discreet, and deeply charitable. No mention was ever made of a partner who vanished. Eleanor Vance never left the asylum. Her forced commitment severed her legal identity. Letters she attempted to write were intercepted or destroyed. Medical notes described her fixation on mechanical objects and imagined substitutions of children, language designed to transform truth into pathology. She died 6 months after admission, officially from complications of exhaustion. There was no funeral. There was no marker bearing her name. The whereabouts of Clara and Rose Vance were never discovered. No school enrollment followed. No census listed them. No graves were recorded. In the bureaucratic silence of the early 20th century, children without advocates simply ceased to exist. Penny survived. She was removed from Eleanor's custody under a different surname and placed in an orphanage several counties away. The watch was taken from her mother before the transfer, cataloged, and locked away. Penny grew up never knowing her real name, her father's fate, or the meaning of the object that once rested in her hands. Records suggest she left the orphanage at 16 and vanished into factory work, one more untraceable woman in industrial America. Arthur Clayton lived into old age. He died respected, wealthy, and untouched by suspicion. His funeral drew city officials and clergy. His portrait hangs today in a regional historical society, labeled simply Industrial Benefactor. Only the photograph tells a different story. Now, when examined with the full weight of context, the image radiates something cold and unmistakable. Eleanor's eyes no longer appear merely distant. They look trapped. The toddler's clenched hands no longer seem accidental. They look burdened. The mirror no longer reflects light. It reflects threat. The snapshot has become the only surviving crime scene. No blood, no witnesses, no confession. Just a woman forced to sit inches from her husband's color, holding a stranger's children, knowing her own were gone, using the only tool left to her to speak across time. She failed in her lifetime, but the photograph did not. More than a century later, it stands as proof that even when power erases records, even when violence hides behind respectability, truth can survive in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough and brave enough to look past what they are told to see. The image is no longer silent, and once understood, it never lets you look away again.